Well, welcome back to AI Med Radiology after an amazing keynote from Geraldine. And our all-star faculty continues for the first session that's going to focus on data. So there's a logical continuum to our day. It's data, machine and deep learning, and then natural language processing. We close off with important issues in radiology. So one of the best things about being a convener of AI in medicine is you get to meet great people outside of your own field. And I'm a cardiologist, so it's been great to work hand in hand with radiologists. And one of the best ones in this area of adopting AI in radiology is Matthew Lungren, who heads up the AI group at Stanford and as a radiologist. And he would be a fantastic person to talk to us and educate us on how do you work on data as a radiologist to execute AI projects. So Matthew, welcome.
Thank you, Anthony, for the great introduction. Great to be here. And I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you today. So I'm going to talk first about kind of an overall vision of the use of medical imaging data, focusing on data as a public good. And I'm going to talk about that concept. And then touch on a few things, and then later on today, as Anthony pointed out in the panel, I'll get into some of the science around using NLP and other technologies to label medical imaging data. So let's start out with some broader overview here. These are my disclosures. So I think when I tell a lot of people that computer scientists and doctors are practically the same thing, I get a lot of puzzled looks. Most of the time it's because they're thinking about, the folks from Grey's Anatomy or ER, and they're not really getting the relationship. But when you think about instead doctors like me who sit behind computers all day, drink coffee constantly, we get carpal tunnel, we have socially awkward actions. This is very similar to a lot of what we believe is going on in the computer science world. But it's not just that. There are also aspects of what we actually do all day that are very similar. We both work on areas where we are looking through, volumetric data and attempting to identify abnormalities and label them. We even go so far as to have commonality around looking at, images, captioning them, and trying to describe what's going on in that image. And that's exactly what we do in radiology. We look through images and we create a narrative that allows that information to be conveyed. Finally, there is some similarity around the idea of using multi-volumetric imaging for various purposes in terms of procedural planning, and we see some of the similar work happening in computer vision. So, when we think conceptually that if it's possible to submit an image and have an automatic caption occur, the same thing ought to be possible, at least that's the vision, for radiology, where we can have an image be processed and have a narrative come out of that in an automated fashion. And so that's really a vision that we all share, and certainly there's many aspects of medicine beyond just radiology, and that's something that we focus on at our center. We look for clinically important problems across the medical school, and we partner with luminaries in the computer science world and really try to drill down on ways to approach different aspects of our healthcare with some of these technologies. And so underpinning a lot of what we do is the idea of how do we, again, ask the right question, have the right domain experts in the room. And here's just some examples of some of the things that we've worked on, everything from chest x-rays to the pre-processing of imaging, all the way to opportunistic screening, et cetera. But again, one common thread that links a lot of what we do and what we look to do is not really the sexiest part of it. And it's really just dealing with data. Data underpins, again, a lot of what needs to happen for many of these projects. And it's actually the acquisition of this data that is quite a bit of the work. What I'd like to say, though, I think for this group, and a concept that I think is something that hasn't quite caught on as much as I'd like to see in the medical community, is the idea of how important data is. I think that we recognize it's a necessary evil, I think that we spend a lot of time on our projects working on data, labeling data, curating data, but we don't really give it the proper due of how important it's been for most of the advancements that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 decades in computer science. And so I'm going to show a couple of popular examples to try to drive this point home for all of you. This photograph is from an article about a pretty big event back when I was a chess nerd back in high school. And this is Gary Kasparov losing to Deep Blue. This was a big deal back then. You know, the same conversations about the world being taken over by robots happened then as we sort of hear now. And this was in 1997. But the algorithm, if you look up the original paper by the researchers who accomplished this, they used an algorithm from 1983. Now, most of us, again, think that, oh, this wonderful breakthrough has happened. It must be some cool new algorithm that really, you know, broke the tie and pushed them over the edge. But actually, when you look back, it was instead this release of an open source data set of chess games. Once that was made available, the researchers had enough data to train the algorithm. Granted, the algorithm was somewhat old, and in just a few years, they were able to accomplish this feat. Here's another example that will hopefully drive this point home for you. If you all remember this, back in 2011, when IBM Watson won the Jeopardy challenge, again, we didn't see that this came from some incredible new algorithmic breakthrough. In fact, the algorithm used there was from 1991. It's pretty incredible. When it wasn't until the Wikipedia project and the Project Gutenberg data was made available, which had, you know, an incredible amount of knowledge put into an open source format, that enough data was acquired for this algorithm to achieve this accomplishment. So again, the data became the primary catalyst. It was actually the reason why a lot of these things were possible and are still possible today. I probably don't have to convince many of you. You probably have heard of ImageNet, and if not, this is pretty much the crowning achievement and what has made a lot of what we're all doing now possible. And again, this isn't an algorithmic advancement. This is an enormous database of highly curated images that were labeled and put online for researchers. And as part of that, there was the ImageNet Challenge that was held for many years. And there was a grad student who actually became the benchmark of the human error rate. And every year what you saw was that the error for the machines went down. And until deep learning finally hit its stride, we began to see that error performance exceeding human ability. And so really that has helped to catalyze what we're all experiencing now today. And again, just to drive the point home, that accomplishment by the Microsoft Research Group, who was the first to do that, again, happened well after this algorithm, the convolutional neural network, was first described. And again, it was the it was the ImageNet data availability that really made this breakthrough possible and allowed enough data to really transform what we're doing. I think that the recognition that data is valuable is certainly not lost on a lot of the economy. We know that this is a very big business, and it's been described as the new oil, I think, by many. And you know, I think for us, we don't really ascribe to that, and that's one of the things I really want to talk about today. Is that we don't. It's difficult to use data as an analogy for oil, because again, this is not something that's consumed. It's easily replicated, and it's not really owned in that traditional sense. It's actually it's more about the rights to control the access to it and the rights to share the profit of having that data. And so it really becomes down to, or data comes down to, particularly in medical data, exclusive access. And that gives some groups advantage and some groups the disadvantage. And this is one of the reasons why these folks are starting to show up, or have shown up, in your hospital systems more and more often. And there is a very big push to not only develop some of these tools and technologies, but to have access to the data, preferably exclusive access, because that allows relative advantage in this marketplace. Again, this is not a new concept. We've seen medical data being purchased and sold on very, very large marketplaces. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and this has gone on for a really long time. And again, this is not something that's typically known by the average patient who kind of walks in our doors. And in fact, you can go online and purchase lists of patients by diagnosis and get a lot of personal information on patients that have, in this case, a malignancy, and maybe that would help you market to them. But this data, this marketplace, isn't helping any of us advance some of the science that we know is possible with large amounts of data in medical imaging AI or in just generally broad clinical machine learning. And what we do tend to see is a kind of a loss of the concept that these medical data are actually people. This is data coming from people who are suffering through some of the worst times of their lives. And the idea that this data is being purchased and sold in multi-billion-dollar marketplaces isn't exactly something that they're aware of. And to add insult to injury, these are the same people that are increasingly going bankrupt because of the cost of the hospital care. Meanwhile, their data is being used in some of these marketplaces. So there is a lot of ethical challenges here that I think that put us all from the healthcare perspective into a place where we have to make a decision on how we're going to use this data, because we know how valuable it is. I showed you how valuable it is in this new environment of the machine learning capabilities. But I also want to point out that this is an ethical decision that we've had to make, and I think everyone's going to have to make. And our position that we hope justifies a lot of what we've decided to do is that again, the clinical data that we generate has a primary purpose. It's obviously to take care of our patients, but the secondary use, we treat it as a form of a public good. Why is it a public good? Because we recognize that we can advance the field as a whole if this data is available to a broader community of researchers. When that's possible, we know that the next patient who has a similar issue can potentially have advanced care or better care because of this data, and this data in aggregate. A great analogy now that we're dealing with the COVID pandemic is the concept that the genome was released of the virus very early on, and that actually allowed many different researchers to continue to come up with cures and therapies at the same time, as opposed to just releasing the one therapy, right? And so having that sharing, the sharing of the information really did perpetuate the advancement of the science that we're seeing. The same thing is what we're seeing here as well. We've tried to write this up in a way just specifically for the medical imaging community, but this certainly translates beyond just images. Obviously, that's something that we focus on, but to try to go into more detail about our justification. And we even have a few scenarios that we kind of play out in terms of, commercial groups actually trying to have access to hospital data and how that relationship could be, constructed in a way that would still be ethical. And again, these are just principles and concept. There's really no steadfast rules here. What we try to do at our center is we've made it a priority to achieve what we're calling the medical image net. So bit by bit, we release large volumes of annotated medical imaging data for research and education. That's the purpose. The process, although many institutions and hospital systems say it's impossible or very difficult, or it's even, we've had folks say that it's not legal, it is in fact quite legal, and it is actually quite easy to do, provided you have some of the systems in place. And again, it's about curating and labeling, which is something that most of us are doing anyway. We go through a manual PHI review, which is sort of the time-consuming component of this, and then having users register and agreed that this is for education and research purposes, not for commercial use. Again, here's some examples of some of the 8 or 9 data sets we've already released. EchoNet is our most recent one, which came on the back of a Nature paper looking at echocardiography. I know Anthony would be interested in this, where they were able to automatically quantify the metrics on echocardiography, which has huge implications for a lot of the handheld and portable solutions that we're starting to see. So there's a lot of excitement around having these data sets out there in the hands of researchers all over the world to benefit. We contributed to the RSNA effort for head CT, and we're really proud to see that with one data set of 25,000 exams, we received 22,000 models that were submitted. The top 10 of those models who were entered into the challenge, the top 10 those solutions were as good as the FDA cleared algorithms that you're seeing on the marketplace. So just to give you a sense of that, again, it's the data and not necessarily the methods, and we're catalyzing research and new discoveries because of that. And just to wrap up with a couple quick concepts, there are lots of groups looking at making artificial data, and we've seen that with synthetic celebrities as shown here, trying to generate data sets that aren't really based on patient data. That's actually because they can use GANs, which are generative adversarial networks, to create a feature space from a training data set and sort of generate new images. And here's some very rough examples of that from chest x-rays. The challenge is that these synthetic data sets don't truly represent new data. Now, some of the new cycle GANs have ways to get around some of that feature space issue, but it's still something to recommend for those of you looking to augment important subclasses, but it's not a replacement for large data sets. And finally, I'll just mention one other thing. We take this approach where we're making these data sets available in one location. Maybe they're contributed from many different hospitals. The concept of federated learning takes that and says, well, can we just distribute the model around and not have to actually make the data available? And that is a tremendously exciting part of research. We're involved in many different projects looking at this because it does avoid having to go through some of those steps to make data available. However, the drawbacks are that it's only going to be the big institutions and those that have the capability that can really take advantage of that. We're not quite sure that the performance of the model is the same as if you had all the data in one place or if you federated the model. So there's still some investigation there. And finally, it does prevent what I believe is the most exciting thing, which is the democratization and access to this data for any researcher anywhere in the world. So my final points, just to drive this home, I have seen, and I think hopefully I've convinced you that open source data is a huge catalyst for a lot of the advancements we're seeing in computer science, and I think the same is coming true for medical data. There are responsible, ethically sound ways to do this. If you're out there and you're publishing your results and you're not making your data available, I would put that more in the marketing category than the science category. And I know that's somewhat of a controversial statement, but we pretty strongly believe that. And again, as I've shown you here at the end, there are some alternative approaches to solve some of the data availability challenges, but ultimately the best move is to make this data available for any researcher to use. And this is my awesome team I get to work with every day at Stanford. Thank you guys for your time, appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Matt. And we all appreciate your passion and your pioneering of just gathering data, which we all know is the hardest part, but it's the absolutely critical foundational layer to everything we're going to do with AI in medicine. So again, thank you for your great introduction to the importance of data, such an important area. So next, we're going to have Dr. Sudhen Desai, who, again, if it wasn't for my passion for AI medicine, probably would not have met him and become a very special friend and colleague. And I also came from Texas Children's, so we do have that same background. So Sudhen is going to talk to us about the challenges of AI and in terms of data security. So Sudhen, welcome.
Thank you, Anthony, and to AI Med for allowing me to participate in today's symposium. It's obviously a great panel and just very gifted speakers and clinicians and industry experts that have been aggregated. I wanted to take a few minutes, maybe not to provide answers, but to provide some food for thought as we talk about, as Matt has eloquently detailed, the aggregation of data and the utilization of data, but how do we keep that data safe and secure? Because as you mentioned, there are some ethical questions, and we'll dive into some legal issues as well. So as we aggregate an esteemed audience, we recognize that perhaps not everybody knows everything. And I actually was going to put a label on this with Anthony Chang listed above the top, and I realized that this guy has nothing to do with the suave Southern Californian that is so intimately graced our rooms and provided us with loads of knowledge. And certainly he would not be making an error such as this one. When you have a group of people that are aggregated that have many skills and talents, there are often points not to spend too much time on. And I think here with this group, there's not really a question as to whether data is important or not. I think we all understand and believe that it can improve patient outcomes. It can help us with public health and healthcare policy decisions, whether at a national or an international level. And then there are individual benefits where we can truly get to a point where we talk about data-driven medicine or individual medicine decision-making, removing emotion out of current decision-making processes that we utilize. And all of this data, as Matt showed in a prior slide, comes from a myriad of places, whether it's EHRs or medical device data such as imaging equipment. We have physiological monitoring data that permeates throughout every healthcare institution, as well as now personal monitoring data such as wearables that are commercially available. There's pharmacy and insurance data, government data. This list could continue. And everyone's getting into this. So the Precision Medicine Cohort Program, which was developed at the National Institutes, has now segued or been modified to be termed the All of Us Initiative. And this took place about 5 years ago. The aim of this program is to collect multiple millions of patient data, such as what was just listed before: EHR, genomic, imaging, psychological, sociological, environmental. It really is the modern day and updated version of the Framingham Heart Study, which many of us came to know very well as we went through our training. And what's intriguing about this is that the National Institutes obviously, advertises this, and we look at the headers that are up there, and immediately we see that one of the top 5, just after you are involved, they detail who's helping, is how we're going to protect you and your data. And it really is illustrative of where healthcare is these days, particularly around some of these data security questions. So what are some of these restrictions that we face to the use of big data in healthcare? Well, I think first and foremost, we have to respect the idea that healthcare as a universal institution is inherently risk averse. And that makes sense. Our job is to take care of people, to avoid making the sick sicker, and we hold that most precious entity in our hands, and that is the life of another human, right? So how do we protect the patients versus this ever-increasing drive for efficiencies and economies of scale? How do we do it so that the cost associated with this data has a demonstrable benefit? And I think to realize the promise of data in healthcare, the community must overcome some of these core philosophical, technological, and organizational challenges. And we're going to dive into some of those here in a second. Now, there are very obvious rationale to protect patient and patient data, right? Legal entities have now been constructed around all of this. There are signs throughout every healthcare institution about the HIPAA guidelines and the titles that were established in 1996, and the protection of boundaries, security, accountability, etc., which was then improved on the omnibus of 2013. And we see in that time frame that we've evolved from these paper charts with labels and dates to more of these electronic records. And the omnibus's point was to simply state that we must upgrade our data security efforts in this ever-expanding digital age. Sorry, and then the EU jumped into the game with the GDPR in 2016, and they detailed their 7 key principles of how to ensure data protection. And then again, as Matt said, there's an ethical component of this which will be expanded on in later sessions. But by and large, I think most people will feel emotionally that the data belongs to the patient. And there are legal constructs around protecting our patients and making sure that the data is not used in an ill-conceived or non-ethical fashion. And even the charting has been brought into the courts, and it really is a gray zone, as was mentioned. What has now come into construction is this dual ownership concept, where the records themselves are potentially owned by the provider. So the physician who owns the EMR owns that information, but the data within those records is inherently owned by the patient. So this is somewhat of a sticky concept to detail and illustrate, and I think that even from a legal standpoint, it has not been well delineated. But what has become clear is what's important to perhaps this audience here, which is de-identified data is no longer considered protected health information under the HIPAA privacy rule. And it can be used for a number of purposes, including aggregation into a data set. And that data set then is owned by the creator. So we do see some potential here, but the key is this word of de-identification. Now, healthcare systems have spent a lot of time and energy then around this concept of data protection and how do you protect their patients. And so there's these best practices that have been developed, and it's a laundry list of how to inform your employees and your institution about handling big data. We here at Texas Children's have engaged outside vendors to assist us with some of our analytics and data flow, and they were kind enough to supply sort of their vision for how this works. But we see immediately that there are checkpoints here that we have to be really careful and cautious about. And that is, as this data starts to migrate into utilization, it's moving outside of the established firewall of the hospital system, and then secondarily has to transfer back in at some point in order to be useful to the entity. So these are big checkpoints that need to be carefully constructed and protected. And herein lies the problem. And I think many of us that live in the healthcare world sort of experience this in many different facets. But even the largest healthcare institutions suffer this perceived information technology gap. Why is that? Well, we tend not to have the most qualified IT personnel because they migrate to higher paying industries such as technology. The institutions as a whole do not have a singular focus on technology and technology development. The number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 job is to take care of patients. If you look in the current environment, you find what I call sort of this technological split. The institutions in the Texas Medical Center all have healthcare development freezes, healthcare IT development freezes. Why? Because we're all focusing on different components of the pandemic as they affect the institution. Now, do we think that industry is doing this? Do we see that industry is freezing their IT development and technological advancement right now? In fact, many of these tech companies are taking advantage of the opportunities that these are presenting. And another point is that most hospital systems find it much easier to contain all of this PHI behind their own firewalls. So therein, the de-identification process becomes much more important. When we look at, for a comparative sake, industry, they tend to be much more comfortable with cross-fertilization and the passage of data between various entities. And I want to take a look at something else. We look at healthcare as this massive multi-trillion-dollar entity, and it is. And when we look at the largest healthcare companies by revenue, and I had to pull 2018 as 19 is not immediately available, we find that we have to go down to Kaiser, which is lower down on the list, in order to actually find a healthcare provider that's on these large revenue, that has a large revenue stream. But Kaiser itself is also defined as a medical benefits company. So the largest sole focus healthcare provider company is HCA, which comes in at somewhere in the mid 40 billions of dollars. And my own institution comes in around 4. Comparatively, when we look at the tech industry, we go down to Panasonic at number 12, again, 2018 revenue data, to find a comparable figure to what we just showed for Kaiser. Now, obviously, this is not an apples to apples comparison, right? Not all of these technology companies are also focusing on healthcare unilaterally, but we begin to get some discrepancies in terms of scale of economies. When we talk to CIOs, both in healthcare and outside of healthcare, that are expecting to use big data and AI type solutions, we tend to see that they favor external or third-party solutions for storage and data share. Now, getting into imaging data, this is where I live on a daily basis. We talked about de-identification and how to utilize it. This is actually a relatively involved process, and there are places that have, turned this into a science, but it's very hard for each individual institution to do de novo and to do it well. It involves removing the PHI from DICOM file headers, removing the necessary headers, making sure then that the output has no PHI even in the file names, exporting that data, whether it's going to go inside of the institution's firewall or external to the cloud. But these steps require detail and attention to detail that oftentimes the institutions don't have bandwidth to provide. So a project that has come up in the pediatric healthcare space is potentially the sharing of data throughout pediatric healthcare institutions. And just the security component behind that is 30 steps. And this has been vetted through various pediatric hospital institutions. In addition to that, there's the privacy management in order to be HIPAA and GDPR compliant. And so this really, I think, begs a question. And here's where we get into the food for thought rather than definitive conclusions. Who really is best suited to de-identify, protect, and then utilize healthcare data? Well, we've seen to some extent that tech companies have revenue, have revenue streams in respect of the business sector. We can certainly dive into, is it better from a commercial standpoint? Is it really something that we want to get into? Is it the healthcare institutions, which are actually patient-facing, but they tend to suffer from smaller scale and revenue? Who really has the systems and the support to be able to do de-identification and data protection well and safeguard the security of the networks? Are these institutions able to put in the infrastructure, particularly as we talk about freestanding healthcare entities, as opposed to those that are embedded perhaps inside of larger university systems? And the question I think that all of us need to sit down and address and answered in part is, who is best suited to own this data and the data sets? We can make an argument here. Is it the government? Well, they already have access to volumes of clinical imaging and utilization data. So perhaps they should just own it all. Maybe they should be the spearhead and the force behind all of this. Or do we want to do it via technology, the tech industry? They have resources, they have efficiencies that most healthcare entities can't match. They have turned utilization of data into these commercial juggernauts. Or should we just leave it in the hands of the healthcare entities? the benefit providers, and the hospitals, which actually treat these patients every day? And I think the answer is, as the Wild West was one, so too we will see solutions develop here. And perhaps the answer is not that it's a single entity, rather that it's a combination of forces that move this forward. And so again, I don't offer this as a conclusion because I don't think there are any at this moment. I think part of the beauty of this type of symposium is aggregating people to think through some of the questions that are posed and hopefully get to interdisciplinary and collaborative answers to make sure that at the end of it all, the data remains secure, safe, and as Matt alluded to, our patients feel that they're not ethically violated or commercialized in manners that they would not want to be.
Thank you so much, Sudhen, for that amazing second talk in this data session. And it just maybe serendipity or not that all three of us are involved with children, and hearing of data perhaps is an even more necessary step towards AI, because we don't sometimes have a large number of patients with certain disease states. So Matt, you mentioned that GANs is a potential, at least a partial solution to lack of data for certain diseases. Has that actually been executed at Stanford?
Yeah, we've looked at trying to use GANs to create some of the important small diseases, even something like a large data set like the head CT challenge. You know, the subarachnoid hemorrhage is super important, but it's not common, right? So, and that's why it's, you know, difficult to sort of have these models catch them. And even some of the big models didn't necessarily pick that up. And so having the ability to augment the training data with some synthetic data is, you know, it's just another form of augmentation. For pediatrics, we have two things that make it difficult for us, and one of the reasons why, you know, we've worked really hard on trying to define our use cases carefully. But you know, with each age group, the imaging appearance is so incredibly different, even in normal, right? So just having the machine not break when it sees a, you know, a 6-month-old versus a 6-year-old is hard. And one of the reasons why you aren't seeing the market flooded with pediatric solutions. But on top of that, thankfully, kids are generally well. And so we don't have enormous amounts of data that is around, you know, very important diseases. And so as Sudhen's point, you know, having the COG, having some central database repositories that work on clinical trials and collect this data, that's probably where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, and trying to find, in my view, ways to standardize things for clinical trials for kids, so that we don't have the variability and we can find the new drugs and new treatment protocols. I think that's some of where the wins are there. We'd all love to have a machine do our scoliosis films and bone ages all day, and that's great. But I don't know if that's where I think the biggest impact is going to be for us. Yeah.
No, thank you. I just want to take this opportunity to thank both of you for being such great supporters of the project that Tim and I was thinking of, having a pediatric cloud for all images, and not just radiologic images. I would love to have all the cardiac images uploaded as well for everyone around the world. So thank you for that. Sudhen, so you had a great introduction to security, as daunting an issue as that is, and you listed literally like 40 some steps. What are the key of those 40 steps? What do you think are the 2 or 3 really key steps that everyone must have?
I mean, I think that is somewhat of a local answer. I think institutions and healthcare institutions in particular are all wired a little bit differently, and so how they approach this will have to be somewhat of a homegrown solution. I think what really always jumps out to me is the real reluctance of healthcare institutions to send data outside of their own protection. And I think that transfer step, even if we state that it's de-identified data, is always met with raised eyebrows and some level of consternation. And the reason behind that, I think, is, you know, is not unfounded. When you look at costs associated with data privacy breaches, you know, these costs run $300 to $400 per patient chart. And when you talk about thousands up to millions of patients that some of these institutions are providing for, those numbers become significant quickly. So, I think one thing is the de-identification process and tightening that up. That usually is done on an internal basis. The data transfer outside of the institution to the cloud or wherever the repository is going to take place, and then the transfer back of the output or whatever it is. And I think, as Matt again alluded to, I think what we're starting to see in some of the solutions that we're looking at are simply provision of data for a third-party development of an algorithm, which then is licensed back or shared back or whatever the setup is. But I think from a security standpoint, we really have to put the wrenches down on how the data goes in and out.
Yeah. Well, as I said, all three of us are in pediatrics, and we have an intrinsic incentive to really collaborate and share data. Do you think the COVID-19 added an extrinsic incentive for you two as radiologists, even though we're just starting to see pediatric manifestation of the disease? Has that kind of broken down some barriers or increased incentives to share data? We'll start with Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, even trying to get projects approved has been much easier, right? I think that everyone from the legal side all the way to the hospital IT side has said, we want to help, we want to step in. Everyone's feeling like they're watching something, burn down and they're not able to help. That's a terrible feeling for everybody. We all have skills. We all have skills that we know we can apply to this. And so I think that's a general feeling throughout everybody in the entire world. For us, I think that we've seen an opportunity here. You're obviously getting a lot of publications and a lot of information out there, but I think that, again, kind of going back to some of the things Sudhen and you've pointed out, that the opportunity to share the data together to have those insights on a broader scale, obviously in pediatrics, it's critical because our cases are lower, but we've worked on an effort just to say, hey, if you have cases and you've curated them and you're working on projects, pooling it all together just seems to be the right thing to do. And so we've been able to do that at the national, international level with an RSNA initiative that we've recently launched, and we'll have a version out very shortly. 200 institutions from around the world are going to contribute labeled COVID imaging data. This is just a start. I mean, I recognize that the pandemic is a crisis and it will run its course, and I hope that we can get to a healthy solution. But I think that this is going to be one of the first real events that help us all realize how important it is and how potentially easy it is to share data. It's not as scary as a lot of hospitals make it seem.
Yeah, I'm sure this is a hype cycle also in and of itself to collaborate, but hopefully after the passion and the dedication wanes, we'll come back to a nice new normal, as they say.
That's right.
More
if we can get the platform and the permissions in place now, then we can continue to use that after the pandemic's over.
Yeah. We got to sustain. Our part is that we're sustaining. Sudhen, how about for you? Have you seen an extra incentive? Yeah.
I very much think so. And I think in particular, it puts some pressure on freestanding institutions. So whether in the adult space or the pediatric space, to actually try and combine resources. And what's been very interesting for those not familiar with the setup of the Texas Medical Center, which is where Texas Children's is housed, is this is effectively a 2-mile land grant where institutions are provided tax-free and structured incentives to operate in an educational mission. And even with that, the institutions have tended to be relatively siloed until we started getting into the planning stages for this. And the amount of crosstalk that's taking place between institutions in this moment is head and shoulders above the aggregate of data share that occurred before the pandemic kicked in. And it's just an amazing and an impressive systematic change from the top executives of all of these institutions down. And it's made it much easier for us to get stuff done, to make requests. But, I think we don't ever want to lose sight of the overall mission, which is that all of this still should be done for the benefit of the patients that walk through each, institution's door. So how do we utilize this appropriately and sustain it, as was just mentioned, so that it has long-standing benefit outside of this crisis? And I think I just want to add one point to that, which is when we look at criticisms of how separate countries and larger institutions are handling this, I think one of the big critiques is that places are trying to go it alone, right? Pharma companies trying to operate in isolation, governments doing things according to their own and not providing a covered approach to this. And I think the healthcare institutions would learn well to heed those criticisms and find ways that data, information, and patient benefit can be shared appropriately.
Yeah, I certainly seen institutional hubris kind of go away during this pandemic, and hopefully the viruses did teach us a lesson about how humans should behave. Viruses don't have a lot of hubris, and that's why probably they're very successful. So thank you both for both your fantastic talks, as well as your continual passion and dedication to promote sharing of medical image data.